Good afternoon. I'm John Bitson, the Menard Family Director of the Sheila and Robert Challey Institute for Global Innovation and Growth. Welcome to the Menard Family Distinguished Speaker Series. I'm really excited today that we're joined by Dr. Tyler VanderWeele, one of the world's leading experts in understanding human flourishing. Not only does he look at how we should measure human flourishing and look at what kinds of things contribute to human flourishing, but he also has some ideas on how we can increase human flourishing as a society. And a lot of researchers use very limited definitions of human flourishing, looking at things like income or happiness. And I think that we'll see that there's a much more complete way to look at human flourishing today. And I'm really excited because we're all going to learn a lot today. We have more than 300 people joining us today, and everyone will have their own chance to ask questions today. And Tyler was just telling me that he really enjoys that part of this. And so please think of questions that you have for Tyler. People that are in the the Louise Event Center will have a chance to ask your questions directly to Tyler by going to the podium. And then everybody else who's online can submit your questions in the Q&A feature of Zoom. So Dr. Tyler J. VanderWeele is the John L. Loeb and Francis Lehman Loeb Professor of Epidemiology in the Departments of Epidemiology and Biostatistics at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, and the director of the Human Flourishing Program and co-director of the Initiative on Health, Religion, and Spirituality at Harvard University. He holds degrees from the University of Oxford, the University of Pennsylvania, and Harvard University in mathematics, philosophy, theology, finance, and biostatistics. I only have a degree in economics, so that's very impressive. And his methodological research is focused on theory and methods for distinguishing between association and causation in the biomedical and social sciences, and more recently on psychosocial measurement theory. His empirical research spans psychiatric and social epidemiology, the science of happiness and flourishing, and the study of religion and health. He is a recipient of the 2017 President's Award from the Committee of Presidents of Statistical Societies. He has published over 300 papers in peer-reviewed journals, and he's the author of Explanation in Causal Inference in 2015, Modern Epidemiology in 2021, and Measuring Well-Being in 2021. He also writes a monthly blog posting on topics related to human flourishing for Psychology Today. And we're very grateful to the Menard family and to all of our donors for making this possible. Without any further delay, I'd like to welcome and introduce Dr. Tyler VanderWeele.
Well, thank you so much for the kind introduction, John, and it really is a pleasure being with you all here today. And I will share with you some thoughts on the promotion of human flourishing. I'll structure this lecture in a few different sections. I'll comment briefly on what we might mean by flourishing, how should we understand this term, and then talk about a particular way to try to at least crudely go about assessing flourishing. I'll then transition to the question, how might we promote flourishing in practice? What are both activities that individuals can do, and also what are the contributions of communities and institutions to promoting well-being? And then we'll offer some concluding remarks and future directions for research. More information on some of the ideas here and the conception of flourishing can be found in this paper, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2017, and on sort of the activities and community efforts to promote flourishing in this 2020 paper in the Journal of Positive Psychology and Wellbeing. And more information on the Human Flourishing program at Harvard can be found on our website. So if we look at our various institutions and academic disciplines, we see that these often aspire to very grand visions of human flourishing. The World Health Organization's definition of health from 1948, still in place today, is that health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. The discipline of economics sometimes conceives itself as the study of how agents go about maximizing their expected utility, supposedly taking into account all aspects of an agent's preferences. The discipline of positive psychology has sometimes been defined as the scientific study of the strengths that enable individuals and communities to thrive. But our actual discussions in studies are often focused on much narrower outcomes, and often very specific disease states or simple measures of feeling happy or to income. They fail to capture this comprehensive notion of flourishing. So what might we mean by flourishing then? Well, if we turn to our dictionaries, the Oxford English Dictionary defines flourishing as to grow or develop in a healthy or vigorous way. The American Heritage Dictionary defines flourishing to do or fare well. The etymology of the term comes from Latin florere, to bloom, blossom, or flower. It's the word that's sometimes used to translate Aristotle's eudaimonia, sometimes also translated as happiness. The working definition we've been using at the Human Flourishing program at Harvard is that flourishing, or complete human well-being, is living in a state in which all aspects of a person's life are good. So very broad, all-encompassing, but really arguably what we're after as individuals and really should be seeking as a society. And I think the discipline that's come closest to trying to assess flourishing is really that of positive psychology, and numerous measures and conceptualizations of psychological well-being have been put forward in the literature, and I think have very much helped advance the field. But notably absent from these measures are any notion of physical health, and are we really fully flourishing if we're bedridden or seriously ill? And I think some of the reason for this is because these typically are measures of psychological well-being, but flourishing encompasses not only the mind but the body as well. Often absent from these various measures of psychological well-being are any notion of character or virtue, contrary to sort of Plato, Aristotle, most of the Western philosophical tradition, and really philosophical, religious, cultural traditions worldwide. But with a notion so broad as flourishing, we might wonder whether it's ever possible to try to measure or assess such a thing. And moreover, with conception so broad, surely the understanding of what flourishing really is going to vary across individuals and cultures and philosophical and religious traditions. So we might wonder, is it ever really possible to achieve any sort of consensus? And while I do think it is the case that a detailed understanding of flourishing will vary across religious and theological and philosophical and cultural traditions, I think we might start with the places where we might attain consensus. And so what I would argue is that although understandings of flourishing will vary across traditions, I think any reasonable conception of flourishing would include the following 5 domains of human life. Not that flourishing is reducible to these 5 domains, but I think any reasonable conception would, whatever else it includes, would include these 5 as well. And these 5 are happiness and life satisfaction, physical and mental health, meaning and purpose, character and virtue, and close social relationships. Again, the argument's not that these exhaust flourishing, but each is a part of it. I think each of these 5 domains also satisfies the following 2 criteria. Each is nearly universally desired, and we have some empirical data now on this as well. And each is also an end in and of itself. It's sought for its own sake. It's not merely a means to some other end. And I think these 2 criteria of being nearly universally desired and being an end might help shape some consensus around what to measure. So as a very crude assessment of flourishing, we've put together a brief flourishing index with 2 questions in each of these 5 domains. The 2 questions were drawn principally from the existing well-being literature questions that were already regularly used. and that had received at least some degree of empirical validation. The only domain where we proposed two new questions were that of character and virtue. And although there's been, I think, a lot of very impressive work that's been done on the assessment of character over the past couple of decades, most of that requires a long battery of questions or items to sort of assess a single character strength. There's relatively little with regard to more global or single item assessment. So we worked with philosophers to develop two items based on the notion of the cardinal virtues, that at the foundation of all moral virtues lie four: practical wisdom, prudence, justice, fortitude or courage, and moderation or temperance. And so the 10 questions we've been using in our research on flourishing are as follows. The first domain, happiness and life satisfaction. First, how satisfied are you with life as a whole these days? Self-reported, 0, completely unsatisfied, 10, completely satisfied. And this is perhaps the most widely used well-being question in the literature. It's used by the OECD, it's used by the UK's annual survey, it's been used by Gallup and numerous other surveys around the world. A version of this will be appearing on next year's National Health Interview Survey here in the United States. And then we supplement that with something more effective on feeling happy. In general, how happy or unhappy do you usually feel? 0, extremely unhappy, 10, extremely happy. The second domain, physical and mental health, 2 self-report health questions drawn from the US General Social Survey and the World Health Organization's mental health survey. In general, how would you rate your physical health, 0 to 10? How would you rate your overall mental health, 0 to 10? The third domain, meaning and purpose. First, overall, to what extent do you feel the things you do in your life are worthwhile? This question is likewise widely used in literature, again by the OECD, the UK's the UK's annual survey, and numerous other cohort studies as well. But then we supplement that with something more cognitive. I understand my purpose in life, 0, completely disagree, 10, completely agree. The fourth domain, character and virtue, 2 questions. The first intended in some very crude way to try to capture practical wisdom and justice. I always act to promote good in all circumstances, even in difficult and challenging situations. Self-rated 0, completely untrue of me, 10 to 10, completely true of me. And then second, a question intended to get, again, in some crude way at fortitude, temperance. I am always able to give up some happiness now for greater happiness later, again, 0 to 10. And then the fifth domain, close social relationships. These 2 questions were drawn from the UK's Campaign to End Loneliness assessment of short instruments to assess social connectedness. First question, I'm content with my friendships and relationships, again, scored 0 to 10, essentially trying to get at the quantity or extent of those relationships. And then second, my relationships are as satisfying as I would like them to be, 0 to 10, essentially trying to get at the quality of those relationships. So in our work, as you'll see, we typically look at each of these 5 domains separately because the dynamics can be quite different across the domains, but we will sometimes, as kind of an overall crude flourishing index, kind of take the average of these 10 questions, but really this should be understood as nothing more than a composite, an average of those 5 more meaningful individual domain assessments. We typically also supplement these 10 questions with 2 others, looking at financial and material resources and stability, since these are important means to sustaining those other ends. And so these 2 questions drawn from the financial well-being literature. First, how often do you worry about being able to meet normal monthly living expenses? 0, worry all the time. 10, do not worry at all. How often do you worry about safety, food, or housing? Again, 0 to 10. And so again, sometimes we'll take the average of all 12 questions for a secure flourishing index, perhaps somewhat less satisfactory conceptually, since financial resources really are means, not ends, but arguably more satisfactory in practice insofar as indicating flourishing over a longer period of time. So we've used this assessment in a number of different workplace and clinical and educational and research settings. And I think these assessments are valuable for the reasons I'll explain later, both for research purposes, but also for kind of understanding at a community level what's going on, what's working well, what's not. But I think it's even helpful at an individual level with regard to opportunity for self-assessment and reflection. And so I'll myself will try to go through these questions every quarter or so to do some life reflection. And I think that can be valuable, that opportunity for reflection. But it can also be helpful for identifying areas where one wants to make improvements or changes in life, where identifying what's not going well can be helpful with regard to tracking over time, what's improving, what's staying stable, what's declining. And so in addition to it sort of research and community assessment purposes, I do think it is helpful at the individual level. Also in some of our workplace settings, when we've administered these surveys, we've gotten comments and feedback along the lines of some questions really made me stop and think, or it was pretty eye-opening to see the areas that I really needed to work on, or relief that someone is asking. I want help in certain areas, or slightly caught off guard with the questions around purpose, or missing a greater purpose, need to reach out and help more and give back. But so I think it's useful for kind of self-assessment, self-understanding, prompting change. But I think it's also useful at kind of community level, local level, national level, understanding what's going well, what's not, and how are things changing over time. So what I have here is data, which is roughly nationally representative of the United States on these flourishing domains, both prior to the WHO declaration of the COVID-19 pandemic in January of 2020, and also in the midst of it, in about 6 months later, in June of 2020. In January of 2020, interestingly, at sort of the national level, most of these domains had an average score of around 7, really across those domains, except for financial and material stability, which was really a full point lower, around 6. And we've seen this in other samples as well, but the other domains around 7. Unsurprisingly, during COVID-19, flourishing across these domains went down on average, but interestingly, it affected different domains in different ways. So with happiness and life satisfaction, again, perhaps unsurprisingly, we had a fall 0.7 of a point, pretty substantial decline. Likewise, unsurprisingly, with mental and physical health, a decline of about 0.7 of a point. The largest fall was with financial and material stability, 5.7 to 4.8, really a full point decline. And perhaps not surprising as well, June 2020 was the height of unemployment in the United States during the pandemic, and also a lot of employment insecurity during that time. But interestingly, some of the other domains were not as strongly effective. Meaning and purpose went down a bit, but not as much as the others. Our character assessments were essentially level. And somewhat surprisingly, the close social relationships assessment went down in a little bit, but not all that much, 0.2 of a point. So it seems people have found other ways to connect, either invest more deeply in those they're living with, or family, or connecting via these online media like Zoom. And so again, some decline, but not all that substantial. And this has been corroborated by other studies as well, which have suggested a slight increase in loneliness during the pandemic, but not as substantial as we might have guessed. Importantly, these averages kind of disguise variability in experience. And during the COVID-19 pandemic, the variability of all these dimensions went up. The standard deviation went up. So while for some say the pandemic may have been a chance to invest more deeply in those living with their family, for others, perhaps especially those living alone, this was perhaps an especially difficult time socially. So it's important to look at not just means, but of course variability as well, and to identify who is doing well, who is not, what might be done about it. But this kind of gives them hopefully some sense as to how these assessments can be useful for understanding what's going well, what's not, who needs help, and what is changing over time. So we've collected this sort of data in a number of different settings, workplace settings with employees at Aetna, Kohler, Owens Corning, and the World Bank, factory workers in Mexico, Poland, Sri Lanka, Cambodia, and China, a group of international flight attendants. We've looked at various clinical settings, mental health patients at BU and Johns Hopkins, various universities, Yale, Brook University, New York University, West Point, various secondary schools in the US, UK, India, and China. Been working with different communities, including that of Columbus, Ohio. This measure has been embedded in various cohort studies, the Nurses Health Study, LSPAC in the UK. We've put it into a randomized trial and a forgiveness workbook, which I'll be describing later. We're launching a major project with Gallup, which I'll also make some remarks on. So trying in different settings to use this flourishing assessment, either for research purposes, as in some of the cohort studies, and some of the workplace studies, or again, to gain understanding as to what's going well, what's not, and who needs help in some of the educational, clinical, and workplace settings, say. Some of the patterns that we've seen, though sort of any cross-cultural comparison really needs to be taken with a grain of salt, because these questions and the numbers might be interpreted differently in different countries. But some of what we've seen is that the financial and material stability domain is often rated the lowest. Not in all settings. That wasn't the case, say, for our employee assessments at Aetna, but for many settings, it really is the financial means that people are struggling most with across these domains. Interestingly, social connectedness is typically ranked higher in other countries than it is in the United States. So this is perhaps cause for reflection here and what we can do to enhance social relationships and community life. In some of our more recent data collection efforts, most of these dimensions actually seem to be increasing with age, really up until person's kind of 70s, 80s. And this is somewhat contrary to some prior work on well-being, which suggested more U-shaped patterns, where those who are young and old were doing well, and those kind of midlife were struggling more. It seems with this more recent data that left part of the U is perhaps flattening. Young people aren't doing as well as they used to be. And so, I think this too ought to be cause for concern and for reflection on what might be happening. And again, dynamics can vary by domain. So perhaps unsurprisingly, with happiness and life satisfaction, we find these scores higher in richer developed countries than poorer developing countries. But with meaning and purpose, it turns out to be the reverse. Those scores are typically rated higher in poorer developing countries. So again, I think opportunity for reflection on what has happened in the West, what might be going on, what can we do to try to enhance meaning and purpose? How do we go about development in a way which does not compromise a sense of meaning and purpose? So to try to understand how people are flourishing around the world and what factors are shaping flourishing, we're launching in collaboration with Gallup and Baylor University, with funding from the Templeton Philanthropies and a number of other funders as well. We're launching a global flourishing study, and this will be of 240,000 individuals in 22 countries that are geographically and culturally and religiously diverse. These 22 countries represent about half of the world's population. We'll be doing nationally representative sampling in each country with Gallup, and we'll be following the same group of 240,000 individuals every year for at least 5 years to try to create a longitudinal panel cohort study on well-being. So of a rich set of well-being measures, including these flourishing index questions, but a richer set of well-being assessments than that, but also the factors that might shape well-being: social, demographic, community, religious, character-based, political, national, economic factors that might family-related factors that might shape well-being in different ways. And so we'll be looking at, over time, what seem to be the determinants or causes of well-being and how this varies across countries and cultural contexts, and also what appears to be universal. So we should have our first round of data collection available in the fall of 2020, and then every year thereafter. This will be an open access data resource hosted by the Center for Open Science. So, in due course, if you're interested in it, this will be available for you also to look at, to understand what is going well, what's not going well, and what factors are shaping well-being across the world. More information, again, on the Human Flourishing Program website. Okay, so I've made some remarks on what flourishing might be, how we might understand it, how we might try to go about assessing it, importance in research. But obviously, we want to not just measure and study flourishing, but to promote it as well. And so the second half of my presentation will be focused really on the promotion of flourishing. And one discipline which I think has made important contributions to this question is that of positive psychology. And a number of positive psychology interventions have been developed and tested in randomized trials, and I think have been found to have important effects on various aspects of well-being. These are really easy to use, do-it-yourself interventions that can be employed by oneself, but could also be encouraged in school settings or workplaces or in clinical contexts as well. So examples of these are one of the best studied are gratitude interventions, things like 3 times a week, write down 3 things you're thankful for and why. And again, randomized trials have evaluated these sorts of interventions. They've been found to have positive effects on increasing happiness, reducing depressive symptoms, improving sleep quality, self-rated health, and these gratitude interventions have been evaluated in dozens of randomized trials. And another of these sorts of interventions are acts of kindness interventions, things like for 6 weeks, choose 1 day each week to do 5 acts of kindness that you might not otherwise do. And it takes quite a bit of planning to do 5 on a single day, but sort of some studies have indicated that 5 on 1 day has stronger effects than 5 spread out over the course of a week, say. But these likewise have been found to improve happiness, reduce depressive symptoms, increase a sense of flow, engagement, and have been evaluated in a number of randomized trials. Another variation on these is kind of identify your top 5 character strengths, say, and on the Penn's Positive Psychology site, there are assessments for doing this. Out of 24 character strengths, what are your top 5? But identify the top 5, and then use each of them once a week in some new way. And this likewise has been found to improve happiness, reduce depressive symptoms, even 6 months later, doing this for a series of weeks. So there are a number of other such interventions. I've summarized some of these and the evidence for them in this paper, Activities for Flourishing, an Evidence-Based Guide. So welcome to take a look at that on our website. We've embedded some of these into a flourishing app, which you can download and use for free on our website as well. And these include sort of not just positive psychological interventions, but also some material on interventions to address psychological distress, kind of cognitive behavioral therapy interventions for depression or anxiety that have likewise been assessed in randomized trials. Certainly we know from countless randomized trials that these are effective in clinical contexts, but I think the evidence suggests that workbooks on these topics can be helpful as well and are easier and cheaper to implement. These aren't really substitutes for professional help, but can be useful for addressing more mild symptoms for depression and anxiety. There are also kind of now cognitive behavioral therapy resources also, which are similar. We've also been working on a forgiveness workbook intervention in collaboration with Everett Worthington, who's a clinical psychologist who's devoted his life to forgiveness. And these forgiveness interventions have been found to, in randomized trials, improve forgiveness, but also reduce depression and anxiety and increase hope. So we've been working with Everett Worthington to try to reduce the principles of these interventions to a short 2 to 3 hour do-it-yourself forgiveness workbook to help people who want to forgive and are struggling to do so. And we're currently evaluating this workbook in a randomized trial of about 3,000 individuals in 5 countries, Colombia, South Africa, Ukraine, Hong Kong, and Indonesia. And again, I think if these are effective, a compelling case could be made that really these should be widely disseminated. The experience of being wronged is very common. And again, looks like we have pretty strong evidence that promoting forgiveness can help not just with forgiveness and with relationships, but also relieving depression and anxiety. So we hope to have the results of that trial out within a year or so. So again, more details in the paper or in our Flourishing app. But there are plenty of things one can do oneself to try to enhance well-being in various ways. But if you look at the domains that these positive psychology interventions are the ones intended to address psychological distress really affect, it's mostly the happiness and life satisfaction domain or physical and mental health. And attempts to change some of the other domains like purpose or character or relationships, I would say are less clear. A lot of the positive psychology interventions intended to try to increase purpose have actually failed. Many of these are not published because they've not been successful, but it looks like it's more difficult to alter something like meaning and purpose just through a little exercise like the ones I've described. And looking at the literature, I think to affect substantially these other domains of purpose, character, relationships, it requires something beyond individual activity. It really requires an embeddedness in communities, participation in institutions, a set of longer-term commitments and relationships. And so I want to spend a little bit of time reviewing some of the research on community and institutional involvements and flourishing. And I'm going to do this essentially through a public health lens. Often in public health, when we assess the population impact of a particular exposure or phenomena or intervention, we think about it through the lens of two different aspects. First, the prevalence of the exposure, how common it is, and secondly, the size of its effect. Something that's common in the population has large effects on the outcomes we care about is going to shape population health. And so if we use this sort of lens for physical health, we're led to things like exercise and nutrition and not smoking and sleep. But we could do the same thing, not just with physical health, but with all of the flourishing domains. We could ask what's common in the population, and that affects not just physical health, but also happiness and life satisfaction and mental health and meaning and purpose and character and relationships. And if we use this sort of lens with all of these domains, the list looks rather different than it does for physical health. So based on a review of the literature, which I'll describe shortly, I would propose four pathways to flourishing. And these are family, work, education, and religious community. There's evidence in the literature that each of these is relatively common in the population, both here in the United States, but also worldwide. And also evidence from kind of rigorous longitudinal studies that each of these has important effects across the flourishing domains. So the argument here is not that these four are exhaustive. Other pathways may be very important to people's flourishing. Maybe participation in the arts, for example, might help for some individuals enhance the various flourishing domains in important ways, but are perhaps less common in practice with regard to kind of deep engagement in those pathways. But again, the claim is not that these four are exhaustive, nor is the claim that these four are necessary. One can flourish even in the absence of one or more of these pathways. Rather, the argument is that there's strong evidence that each of these pathways powerfully affects those various flourishing domains, and each is common in the population. And so that if greater effort and from individuals and also from kind of policy thinking helped contribute to these pathways, that kind of population flourishing would be enhanced. So in terms of kind of trying to identify these pathways, this was based on a review of the existing literature in that paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2017, and really an attempt to restrict consideration to the most rigorous studies, data that came from some longitudinal experimental or quasi-experimental design. So for one slide, I'm going to make some more methodologic comments and then kind of return to more general, accessible discussion. But this literature review did exclude all cross-sectional designs where all the variables were collected at the same time, because it's really difficult to use such cross-sectional studies to assess evidence for causality. To see this, we've known for some time that marriage and happiness are correlated. But is that because marriage gives rise to greater happiness, or is it because happy people are more likely to go on to get married? In fact, there's evidence for both, but from cross-sectional data, we just can't tell. Likewise, religious service attendance is associated with lower rates of depression. But is that because religious service attendance protects against depression, or is it because those who become depressed are more likely to withdraw from their religious communities and other forms of community life? Again, with cross-sectional data, we can't tell. There's evidence for both, but we do need longitudinal studies to discern that evidence. So really, ideally, we want longitudinal studies which control for the outcomes we're interested in at baseline to rule out reverse causation. We want a rich set of covariates that we're controlling for. We want to assess sensitivity analysis, robustness to unmeasured confounding. Ideally, we want multiple such studies and synthesize evidence from longitudinal studies and meta-analyses. So that's kind of ideally what we're aiming for in kind of developing the evidence base that we're seeking. And in some cases, these restrictions to kind of longitudinal studies control for baseline outcome led to discarding the vast majority of studies. For example, studies of religion, participation, and happiness. While there were over 100 studies at the time this literature review was done, all but one failed to meet these more rigorous criteria. The literature has in fact improved in the 4 years since then, but this kind of gives a sense as to when we move to these flourishing outcomes and these what are sometimes considered these softer exposures, we have a lot more work to do with regard to rigorous studies. And so this was one of the motivations for the launch of this global flourishing study as well. So the evidence can be summarized in this figure here, where we've got the 4 pathways on the left and the 5 flourishing domains on the right. And these numbers here are references to papers which can be found in that literature review that presented evidence from longitudinal experimental or quasi-experimental designs for potential effects in each of these directions. So in some cases, the evidence base was quite substantial. In other cases, it was really just restricted to 1 or 2 studies. More work arguably needs to be done. But in any case, this was the literature review kind of arguing for those 4 pathways as being important. I don't have a lot of time to talk about kind of potential policy implications, so I'll restrict this to a few brief cursory remarks, but we can certainly come back to this in the Q&A as well. But kind of the big picture idea is policies that would contribute to family or work or education or religious community really would enhance human flourishing. So I think many policy discussions are restricted more to an economic lens, and I think that lens is really very important. I mean, as we've seen, often people are struggling most in that financial security domain. But it's not all that people care about. People also want to be happy and healthy. They care about their relationships. They want to be a good person. They want a sense of meaning. And so, I think we should broaden that lens to consider all of these flourishing domains. And we may be led to different sorts of programs or policies. So, for example, I think welfare policy shouldn't disincentivize work, because while providing financial resources and healthcare, I think is valuable and should be done, work contributes not just to those economic and health ends, but it also creates an opportunity to use one's character strengths. It gives one a sense of purpose. It provides a forum to build relationships. And so the contribution of work to human life is really not just those material ends, but these other flourishing ends as well. So I think it's important not to disincentivize work. And I think there's been some really important work done helping even those who are disadvantaged or mentally ill find work and sustain work. Supportive employment programs have been evaluated in a number of randomized trials and have found to contribute in these ways. So I think caring for those who are most in need is critical, but I think we need to do a lot of careful thought with regard to how also to allow them and empower them to work, to contribute, to find meaning, to build relationships. With regard to marriage, I think concerning the welfare system, we should eliminate marriage penalties in the welfare system. Some states have welfare systems where if you marry, you lose your welfare benefits because combined income goes up, and I think this is problematic. Marriage does contribute to well-being in these ways, so it certainly shouldn't be disincentivized. And I think likewise, there's been some interesting work done on online forms of marital counseling, do-it-yourself programs, and I think wide dissemination of these have been tested in randomized trials and have been found to improve marital quality. And I think widespread dissemination of these could really help. I think a lot of marital counseling is not evidence-based. A lot of people don't want to engage because it's expensive or embarrassing. So I think these online programs, if widely disseminated, might provide a way forward to try to address problems before they get so severe that divorce seems to be the only option. With regard to education, I think it's really important that all students have access to good teachers. I think this can be particularly problematic in disadvantaged contexts where often some of the poorest teachers end up, and I think ensuring good education for all is really critical in enhancing population flourishing. I think likewise, the flourishing lens can make an argument for freedom with regard to school choice. We have a study coming out, I think tomorrow, actually, on different school types and their effects on well-being, and it's not uniform. Different school types have different advantages. Comparing kind of public schools to homeschooling, say, we look like we're getting larger effects on character with homeschooling, but larger effects on college attainment with public schooling. So these are different ends, and different individuals might value these different ends differently. Flourishing is not monolithic. It's not a single number. It's across these domains. So again, I think these broader flourishing lens can potentially provide an argument as well for parental school choice. I think on religious community, ensuring that laws empower religious liberty, that these religious communities are able to retain their tax-exempt status to carry out their work is important, because you see large effects of participation in religious community across these different flourishing outcomes. I think it's also important to kind of correct unbalanced portrayals of religion in the media and the academy. Certainly, there have been numerous instances where religious communities have acted harmfully, and I think these need to be taken seriously and addressed. Sort of the recent sexual abuse scandals in various churches, I think, is an important such instance. We've hosted an event on the Human Flourishing Program on trying to empower communities to take this seriously, to address these issues. So I think the problems are important, need to be taken seriously. But I think there shouldn't be sole focus on that. I think there should likewise be balance with regard to the contributions of these communities, both to the lives of others in providing medical care and food pantries and so on, but also to the lives of the individuals who participate in them, which again, I think rigorous research suggests enhances meaning, health, longevity, happiness, and social relationships. So again, I think we need a more balanced portrayal of the contributions of these communities. So these are just a few preliminary thoughts and reflections on kind of the implications of this broader flourishing lens for policy. In terms of kind of future directions of this work, again, with the Global Flourishing Study, we're hoping to study the individual and societal determinants of well-being in a rigorous way. But going forward, we're also trying to broaden our set of well-being measures. As I noted earlier, while I think each of those 5 domains, happiness, health, meaning, character, social relationships, is important and is a part of well-being, I don't think that's exhaustive of what well-being or flourishing really is. I just think might be easy or easiest to find consensus around those 5. But I think we need to also do exploration on what else does flourishing include. So we've been doing some preliminary work on assessments of community well-being not just at the individual level, but what does it mean for a community to flourish, and assessing things like good relationships, proficient leadership, a sense of welcome and belonging, a shared mission, structures to sustain communities over time. And so we have a preliminary measure which we've used in cities like Columbus, Ohio, and in schools and religious communities. This work is at an earlier stage of development, but I think looking at community well-being is also very important, both at local and at national levels. I think our country is in real need of greater national communal well-being. We've also been doing some preliminary work on tradition-specific assessments of spiritual well-being for many individuals across the world. Religion or spirituality is very important to them, and for many, it's the most important aspect of well-being. And while there are some generic spiritual well-being assessments out there, I think really to do this well, one needs tradition-specific measures. How spiritual well-being is understood in a Muslim versus a Hindu or a Christian or a Jewish communities is going to differ. And so we need assessments that allow these communities to assess how they themselves feel they're doing with regard to the ends that they feel are most important. So we've been doing some preliminary work on that as well. I think more work needs to be done on sort of incorporating more non-Western perspectives. Much of the well-being research and literature is really dominated by Western academics. So we've been partnering with the Japanese Wellbeing for Planet Earth Foundation and Gallup's Global Wellbeing Initiative to try to assess non-Western perspectives. And one of the things that I think has emerged from this preliminary work is that kind of notions of balance and harmony and peace, while nearly universally desired, are given much more emphasis in non-Western than Western culture, so that we need to perhaps do better well-being assessment on these dimensions as well. And I think there's more work that could be done on adaptation to a specific context as well. We have an adolescent version of our flourishing index, but maybe further reflection needed, say, on an end of life and other settings as well. So in conclusion, I think flourishing is an important overarching concept pertaining to all aspects of a person's life being good. I think this is important personally for each individual. But I think it's important that we incorporate these sorts of perspectives, both in our research and in policy discussions. So on the research side, what I would advocate for is kind of looking not just at narrow health outcomes or disease states or income, but incorporating these other aspects of well-being as well, like meaning, like relationships, like character. And ideally in studies that look at the effect of a single exposure or intervention or phenomena at a number of different flourishing outcomes all at once. What I'm calling and have introduced methodologically as a sort of an outcome-wide design. So more information on our website and examples of this sort of outcome-wide approach to the study of well-being are available. I think likewise, we need better research support in terms of kind of government and university funding for these other domains beyond health and income. Again, I'm all for studying health and income, but I think we need similar rigorous research on these other domains as well. I mean, why is it that we know so much more about the determinants of cardiovascular disease than we do about the determinants of what gives rise to a sense of meaning and purpose in life, despite that being desired by almost everyone? And again, I'm all for the study of cardiovascular disease, but I just think we need to devote similar research efforts to these other aspects of flourishing. I think government should start tracking flourishing measures over time to get a sense as to what's going well, what's not, who needs help, and how is this changing. I think there has been some really important progress in this regard over these past decades, CD, UK, and other countries. But I think it's really important that we not focus solely on GDP. I think GDP is a helpful measure, but we should supplement that with these well-being assessments. Likewise, I think employers, medical centers, universities, schools could start tracking flourishing over time, identifying what's going well, what's not, who needs help, how to improve this. I truly believe that what we measure shapes what we discuss, what we know, what we aim for, and policies put in place to achieve it. So I think measurement and assessment is critical. I think we should be aiming for flourishing both personally and as a community. That concludes my presentation. Thank you all for listening, and happy to take questions. Thank you again.
Thank you, Tyler. What a great presentation. And just to re-emphasize, I think it's great the work you're doing on understanding flourishing, but also just raising awareness that we all should be considering these other aspects of flourishing. I mean, again, as an economist, as you already pointed out, a lot of times we just focus on income or, very limited measures of flourishing. I think it's really important for researchers to think about it, but also society in terms of policy. And so that leads, you talked a little bit about policy. And one of the things I thought was very interesting in doing some background reading on your work is that you talked about a total life saved approach to dealing with the pandemic. Early on in the pandemic, you said that when we look at policy, you look at total lives saved. And you emphasize the importance of the fact that policy can impact deaths from other causes not related to infection-related deaths. And so looking at this, after all the policies that have been implemented, do you think that we as a society paid close enough attention to other effects of flourishing or even the effects on death of policy in addition to just thinking about the infection-related deaths?
Yeah, so I think it's a complicated question as to how to go about doing this in practice. I would firmly defend the principle that if we're going to focus on total lives saved and lost, we should look at deaths not just due to say the spread of COVID-19, but also that due to social and psychological and workplace factors as well. I mean, there's evidence that sort of loss of employment is associated with maybe 50-70% higher mortality, the loss of social support or experiencing depression, maybe a 30% higher mortality rate. And so policy decisions around the pandemic certainly affected not just the spread of COVID-19, which again, I think was critical and essential and needs to be taken into account, but also affected mental health, affected social relationships. So again, maybe not as substantially as we might have thought initially, and for a time at least, severely affected employment. So I do think these other outcomes should be taken into account, both for their own sake, but even if the focus is going to be kind of on a total lives saved approach. How to do this in practice, I think, is a challenging matter. Often you don't know, the consequences of policy decisions in advance. As has also been clear, we haven't known the dynamics of COVID-19 in advance. When was the vaccine going to be ready? What were its effects going to be? What was going to happen to the variants? I think there have been a lot surprises. So it's not as though the flourishing lens kind of solves all of our difficulties in decision making. I just think it introduces a broader set of important outcomes that people care about, that should be seriously taken into account, both for their own sake and also for their effects on mortality itself.
Yeah, I mean, and thank you. And so, and I think, I mean, that this is my perspective, but I think that your work just emphasizes the importance of thinking about those things when we do implement policy, whether policy would have changed or not. At least let's have a discussion about these other impacts and bring it out in the open, because they are important as well. So I also just, you already talked about work, and I think it was, you talked a little bit about the impacts of work and how it can influence flourishing beyond just meeting material needs. But I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit more in detail of the importance of work. And then in particular, I'm curious, did you look at people that are in unpaid work? So let's say that you're taking care of your children at home. Did you look at the impact that that has on flourishing at all? Or I know that you looked at other studies, but did you find studies that did that?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a good question. With regard to work, again, I think good evidence that employment enhances these various flourishing domains. Unemployment really detracts from them. We've done other studies looking at kind of the relation between well-being in life and well-being at work, and have found interesting relationships where although there are often effects in both directions, sometimes it's stronger in one direction than the other. I mean, somewhat counterintuitively, life satisfaction has stronger effects on job satisfaction than job satisfaction has on life satisfaction. But for example, we find that having good relationships at work contributes substantially to a sense of having good relationships in life as a whole. But the reverse isn't so much the case. If you feel you've got good relationships in life as a whole, it doesn't necessarily enhance one's relationships at work. With meaning in life, it's the opposite. You sort of bring your sense of meaning, your cognitive understandings into the workplace, but meaning at work doesn't give you a sense of meaning in life. Though with purpose, it's sort of the reverse. So purpose and meaning are often used interchangeably, but really meaning is having an understanding of the greater context of things. Purpose is more end-directed, and for purpose, we find purpose at work gives rise to purpose in life, but it's not the reverse. So we find interesting directions, but I think on the whole, it's very clear that what happens at work really does contribute to one's flourishing in life, and so that managers and individuals have an opportunity to use work to enhance well-being. And I think more ought to be done in that regard. We spend so much time at work. With regard to unpaid forms of work, I think this is an area which needs further study. I would certainly consider taking care of children at home to be work, and important work, and really important to sustain societal flourishing. Without kind of the next generation, there will be no society. There will be no flourishing. There's been, I think, a number of good studies on volunteering, and that has pretty important effects on physical health. It turns out some on mental health, probably less on happiness, but important effects on purpose, for example. So I think there's been good work on volunteering. I don't think there's been sufficiently good work on sort of work understood as taking care of children and the effects that has on the parents' outcomes. There's been more on childhood outcomes, which I think is central and important, but on the parents' outcomes themselves. There have been a number of studies on having children and the effects that has on well-being, and it really does vary across countries. Again, going back to policy discussions, countries' policies with regard to children really do seem to matter. The United States does not do so well in this regard. Having children tends to detract, at least short term, the parent's well-being. But again, that's very different than what does actually taking care of a child, deciding to devote one's time and life to that due to one's own well-being or the child's well-being. So I think we do need more study of these matters, and also greater policy consideration with regard to how to enhance family life, how to reverse this trend where other countries are doing better and the United States we're not doing so well in this regard.
So very, very interesting. I'll ask maybe one or two more questions. But I found it very interesting is you talked a little bit in your presentation about the forgiveness workshops, and when people think about promoting public health, they don't often think about promoting love and forgiveness. And you find scientific evidence that love and forgiveness are both very important for well-being and for human flourishing. So could you just talk a little bit about their roles in promoting human flourishing?
Yeah, so I think there's very strong evidence from meta-analyses of randomized trials and intervention studies that these forgiveness interventions in a clinical context, and this is sort of 20 sessions one-on-one with a therapist, so pretty resource intensive, but I'd say the evidence is pretty definitive that these sorts of forgiveness promotion interventions improve forgiveness, reduce depression, reduce anxiety, improve hope. To my mind, that's been established. I think there's still an open question, and this is what we're trying to definitively address in this randomized trial, whether those same principles can be reduced to a sort of do-it-yourself workbook format that tries to distill the most important principles and approaches to something that could be done on one's own. There's some preliminary evidence from a small randomized trial of a longer workbook that this does seem to have effects, but again, it was a small trial. It was also a longer 7-hour workbook, and kind of compliance finishing it because it was as long was not so good. So I think it's an open question whether this 3-hour intervention really will be effective. I think my guess is it will be, but that's why we're running the randomized trial. We want to know because we don't want to start disseminating this if it's ineffective. But if it is effective at promoting forgiveness, reducing depression and anxiety, then I think a case can be made. I think a pretty strong case that forgiveness itself might be treated as a public health issue. Going back to that public health lens, public health impacts the function of two different factors: how common something is and the size of its effects. And the experience of being wronged is very common. And from the existing evidence, it looks like forgiveness has at least moderate effects on depression and anxiety. And so I think something like a forgiveness workbook, because it's free and easy to disseminate, could be part of, say, psychiatrist toolkit, or we could imagine kind of local, national, international forgiveness campaigns to help people who want to forgive and are struggling to do so. And again, provided these workbooks really are effective, I think kind of disseminating these widely could make really substantial improvements to society's mental health. I think also potentially to improved relationships. I think certainly in this country, in the United States, there's a lot of tension, a lot of animosity, a lot of political division, a great deal of racial tension, and forgiveness is not the full solution. We need to address matters of inequality, of justice. There are real policy disagreements as well. But I do think having goodwill towards the other who you disagree with, or who's offended you, is really important if we're going to function well as a society, as a country, if we're going to have communal well-being. So I do think forgiveness in particular, but love more generally, love of neighbor, love of all people, love even of one's enemy, and that I think that's kind of getting at forgiveness is having goodwill for others is really critical to the promotion of societal flourishing. So this is an important direction that Human Flourishing program at Harvard has been and will be taking in the years ahead.
Yeah, thanks. And in a second, we'll go to questions from the audience, but I just wanted to put a plug out. There's a very interesting, I think you have a very interesting paper that it's a popularized paper that talks about a reach method of forgiveness. And so I would just recommend that to the audience, is that it's a way that to practice forgiveness in a practical way when it's really sometimes difficult to forgive people. And I think it's just kind of neat that you have just a step-by-step approach. So that's really pretty cool. So thanks. And I'm going to give a second for the audience to get online. There's a little bit of a delay. So Challey, could you please put the audience on and we'll have questions from the audience. Okay, so I can see the Louise now. And again, if anyone in the Louise has a question, it looks like Clay Rutledge has a question. So Clay, I'll let you ask the first question.
Hi, Tyler. Thanks for joining us. It was great to have you share your work with us. So I study meaning in life and related issues, and I have a question about how you think about flourishing at the temporal level. And what I mean by that is, in the moment, you can capture states like, right now I feel good and happy and connected. But from my research, we find that a lot of negative states right now may actually promote growth and flourishing in the future. So my sadness today might lead to gratitude tomorrow, right? My even stress and anxiety today might be in the pursuit of goals that in the long term will help me improve my life and the life of others. So I'm just curious how you think about things like suffering and loneliness and the type of life stressors and disconnections that might actually help us develop character and grow. And how do you measure that? And how do you think about it theoretically?
Yeah, thank you. Good to see you, Clay, but thank you for a very fine question indeed. I think suffering is sometimes viewed as being an antonym of flourishing. And I don't think that's the right way to think about it. I think suffering always indicates the loss or absence of some good. It always indicates the absence of some aspect of flourishing. But I think, as you were saying, suffering itself can often be the cause of further growth, growth in character, potentially growth in relationships, potentially spiritual growth, or provide an opportunity to find new meanings. And so we take that quite seriously, and we have a kind of a 7-item personal suffering assessment that we've been using in our work to try to assess suffering and to try to study its effects on growth. We do have an item on suffering embedded in the Global Flourishing study as well. And I think there are a lot of open questions, at least with regard to kind of rigorous longitudinal studies with large sample sizes over time. I think suffering as a concept has been somewhat neglected within medicine. We'll talk about mental health, mental illness, depression, but from our studies, suffering is something distinct still, and one can be suffering. Say from loneliness without being clinically depressed. And so I think we need more research to understand those dynamics. What we've seen in some of our preliminary research to date from this personal suffering assessment, at least, and these are short follow-up periods. It's a longitudinal study, but only 1 year, is that the experience of suffering itself doesn't seem to be overly positive a year later. While we see growth with some individuals, most of the time that's still predicting declines in these flourishing domains, smaller declines in character than the others, but on average doesn't seem particularly helpful. Now, maybe growth takes place over a longer period of time, or maybe on aspects of character that we're not assessing. But we've also been doing some preliminary work on, well, maybe what matters is response to suffering. And so we're at present working on kind of a response to suffering assessment. When you suffer, do you just try to ignore it, or blame others, or withdraw, or blame God, or do you try to find meaning? Do you try to find opportunities for character growth? Do you try to turn to others in the community to try to clarify your values, or seek the most important purposes, or find ways for spiritual growth? And so, our speculation, I don't have any data on this at present, is that that response to suffering is critical. And it may be the case that experience of suffering on average actually does over time lead to declines in flourishing, but with appropriate responses to suffering, it can lead, I think, as you've indicated, to important aspects of growth. So again, I don't view suffering as the antonym of flourishing, just as always indicating at least the absence of some flourishing, but as providing the opportunity, when properly responded to growth, to a greater flourishing, as indeed you indicated.
So we have a question from the online audience. So what do you think of the so-called Great Resignation post-COVID? So people quitting their jobs or retiring, is this an indicator that work hasn't been providing flourishing and that people are looking elsewhere to flourish?
Yeah, I mean, I think the causes of the Great Resignation are probably diverse. I think it's not just one story. I think some of it is it is the fairly substantial economic assistance that people have had. I think in other cases, it's provided that COVID has provided an opportunity to kind of reevaluate life and the sort of work that one wants to do. I think some of it has been driven by kind of a labor shortage giving rise to greater opportunities, and so it can make sense to resign and spend a little time to find better work. I think some of it's come from the difficult educational context, and schools often not meeting in person, and challenges with helping children in education, homeschooling, childcare. So, I mean, I do think that the causes are quite diverse, but I do think an important part of it is COVID itself having so disrupted life that it forces people to reflect. What is it that I care most about? What is it that I want? Is my work meaningful? Do I need to keep working if I'm close to retirement age? Do I want to work, or do I want to spend more time with my children? I think all of these are very reasonable reflections that have arisen as a result of COVID, and insofar as it's leading people to a greater flourishing, I think that's good, and I think we probably will continue to see greater changes in the workplace in the years ahead. So again, I don't think what's happened indicates that work is not a path to flourishing. I think the evidence suggests that it is, but certainly different forms of work are more meaningful and beneficial than others. Different work arrangements and work-family balance are more advantageous to flourishing than others. And going back to your earlier question, John, I think people can find flourishing taking care of children as well, and spending time in family context. Work is an important pathway to flourishing, but it's not the only pathway. I do think family is likewise, a critical pathway as well. So I wouldn't in any way see the Great Resignation as a challenge to the notion that work is an important pathway to flourishing. But I do think it has risen in part, not whole, but in part from a deeper reflection on what flourishing is and what people really care about. And insofar as that's the case, I think it's good.
Excellent answer. I mean, so yeah, people didn't just quit work and then just do nothing. They're doing something else that's meaningful in their lives or that is giving them flourishing. Are there if there's other people in the Louise that have questions, please go up to the microphone and I'll let you ask your question. And if you're too shy to ask, relay it to Clay and he'll come up and ask the question. So another question from the online audience is there any longitudinal work being done on the impact of climate change on human flourishing that you're aware of?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there's certainly been a lot of very fine work done on potential consequences of climate change to physical health, to what this may do to our cities, our economic activities. I imagine there's been some work done on at least some of these other domains. I mean, of the other domains, happiness is the one that's perhaps best studied. I don't know definitively whether there have been studies on climate change and happiness. My guess would be yes, but I don't know them. But I do think the flourishing lens is important on this topic as well. And I do think climate change is a real problem that needs to be taken seriously at the global level. I think it has and will continue to have impacts on human life. But I think when we go about decision making, we need to take a lens, once again, not just of income and GDP and physical health, but also what are decisions doing to relationships, to meaning, and I think there are probably some difficult trade-offs, with regard to what would we as a human society genuinely have to give up to achieve different trajectories concerning climate change. And while I think it's a critical issue, it needs to be thought about and addressed. I think it needs to be done in a holistic perspective of human flourishing and in discussion what we are and we are not willing to give up as individuals and as communities. So I won't pretend to have kind of the answers to the right way forward, the middle way in some sense, but I think these are real challenging questions, but I would advocate for a flourishing lens here as well.
Yeah, I mean, so that's one great thing about your work is that you're providing a framework to think about these things, but you're also providing data to people. I mean, when you collect these data, that people can also study various issues as well. Tim has a question in the Louise.
Oh, thank you, Tyler. This is the second time I've heard you speak, and both times very insightful. By the way, I had no question, but I guess I'm channeling my wife. I guess that's what you do after 52 years of marriage. She's an end-of-life doula, and so I know that what she wants to know is, in the context of end of life, what kinds of issues are you trying to get at, and would you like to know more about?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very, very good question. And I do think, the flourishing lens is appropriate in end-of-life care as well. I think there needs to be an acknowledgement in end-of-life care that certain aspects of flourishing, especially physical health, are not going to be going particularly well. That's just sort of a given. Death is not far off, and there will continue to be physical decline. I don't think that means that one can't flourish at the end of life. Flourishing is again, it's not unidimensional, it is multidimensional. And so while physical health will be declining, that doesn't necessarily mean that one doesn't have a sense of meaning or doesn't have good relationships, or that one can't be happy even at the end of life. But I do think too many of our end of life discussions are probably once again shaped by considerations of health and of financial decision making and resources, and to a certain extent by happiness. And I think a lot of the discussion around euthanasia is shaped through the lens of those three. And while I do think health and money and happiness are important considerations, I think we also need to bring in questions of relationships, of meaning, of character. And to my mind, the evidence suggests that sometimes working through difficulties and end-of-life care can actually help bring reconciliation in relationships at the end of life, can help one ponder what the meaning of life really is, can help develop character even in one's final months. There sort of was one study of euthanasia requests that had indicated that the majority of these really are more existential concerns rather than physical pain. And I don't think ending life prematurely is the right way forward, if that's the case. And again, I think addressing these questions of meaning, of relationships, of character at the end of life is really important. So how best to adapt these flourishing assessments and end of life care, as I said, I think it's an important and open direction of work. We've kind of not done yet cognitive testing and qualitative work in end-of-life settings. We have in long-term care facilities, but that's a little different than say end-of-life care, hospice care. So again, I think the framework is relevant there, but how best to move forward in that space, I think does need additional development.
We have another question from the online audience. So could you tell me how flourishing differs, or does flourishing differ from a gender perspective at all?
Yeah, so I do think, as I said earlier, that those 5 domains of human life, happiness, health, meaning, character, relationships, are nearly universally desired, and I think by both men and women. When we've done assessments, not just of how people are doing, but how important each of these domains are, we see fairly similar responses across genders on sort of a scale from 0 to 10. The average response is 9 out of 10. Occasionally we'll get people who sort of say 0 or 1 or 2, but that's not the case for the vast majority. And in our Aetna sample, while there was a little differences across domains, the ordering was actually the same for men and for women. We did find that women, in that particular sample, that women rated every domain just slightly more important than men did. They thought everything was more important, but again, the differences weren't vast. Most of these domains, the average score was kind of 9 out of 10. So I do think these domains are important for everyone. Now, I also said I don't think these domains capture all of what is meant by flourishing. And like it is the case that I think there are, say, tradition-specific differences in and understanding of spiritual well-being. I think one could probably make a compelling case that beyond these 5 domains, with regard to what else is included, that might differ by gender as well. This is only anecdotal, and don't want to overemphasize gender stereotypes either. But I found more women than men who haven't married and haven't had children and sort of regret not having children. Certainly, men can have that experience as well. But my guess is if one did nationally representative samples, and again, these are averages. This doesn't mean everyone. But that kind of the very act of having children as part of well-being might, in our current cultural context, be given a stronger emphasis amongst women than men. Again, I'm not certain of that. It's sort of somewhat speculative, but that would be my guess. Those differences are probably also going to vary by country and by culture as well. So we've not to date explored in depth kind of gender-specific understandings of well-being, but my guess is that there certainly are some. But again, across these 5 domains, we find relatively little differences with regard to kind of the importance people assess to the different domains, comparing men and women.
Okay, thanks. And we have another question that came in from the online audience. So they say that the sources of flourishing for some people may be sources of pain or trauma for others. And so the example they give is they say when it comes to LGBT life, that access to religious groups or family that don't affirm your identity can be traumatic and difficult to forgive. So do you have research on flourishing in that kind of context at all?
Yeah, so I mean, there has been not a lot, but some work on participation in religious communities of the LGBT population, and most of it's cross-sectional, so difficult to draw definitive conclusions. But there have been a couple of longitudinal studies, at least, with sort of mixed results. One suggesting improvements in well-being, another suggesting declines. I think probably a lot of it is going to be context specific with regard to the nature of the religious community, and also the the beliefs and commitments of the person participating. So that sort of, I'm not an expert on this topic, and my knowledge of literature on this particular aspect probably now two years dated. So it's possible more has come out. I think from the perspective of religious communities, or at least from my own tradition, Christian tradition, I do think love of neighbor, love of all people is important. Seeking their good, I think that should be a strong value within religious communities. But these communities, at least some of them, also have long-standing moral teachings and traditions which they seek to uphold as well. So I think important work needs to be done. Important reflection needs to be done with regard to how does one love one's neighbor in that sort of setting and context. So I think it is a challenging topic, and again, I would say the existing empirical literature, while it's thin, suggests that it can be different for different people in different communities, and probably context and response and personal beliefs and commitments make a great deal of difference.
So if you don't mind, we'll squeeze every minute out of you. So I just have one more question that came online here. And so it's, what are some ways that a more balanced, in other words, a less negative portrayal of the role of family and religion can be brought into university settings?
Yeah. So, with regard to family, I mean, it is a little puzzling to me. There's sort of there's almost a little cottage industry trying to undermine the positive effects of marriage, but the results are pretty robust. We will have a study coming out, I think, next year. I'm trying to kind of close the last potential loophole and an objection to this work. And I think, honestly, the conversation should just move on, and it should be how to enhance both family life and single life as well. How do we promote flourishing in both contexts? There are questions around the relative effect sizes and so on, and the effect sizes of marriage on the individual's well-being. I think it's clear, but they're not enormous. And again, I think likewise work should go into how do we enhance flourishing of those who are single as well. But I do think family is a really important context with regard to the development of children, and I think there the effect sizes are much larger. They're profound. I mean, we need, if we're going to sustain society, we need to shape and form the next generation. So I think we really do need to support families and the formation of children from a societal well-being perspective. That seems abundantly clear. With religion, as I said during the talk, I do think the nuance is important, presenting both the positive and the negative, and I don't want to pretend that religious institutions haven't done harm. I think on the whole they've contributed a whole lot more benefit than harm, but the harms need to be taken seriously, need to be addressed by society, need to be addressed by the religious communities themselves. And so I think pointing out the shortcomings of religious communities, or they're not taking their own teachings on love, say, seriously is important. But I don't think it should be restricted to that. And I think there has been an overemphasis on that aspect of it within academic settings, within my own discipline, public health. Religious communities in some African countries are providing up to 50% of the medical care, and then likewise have really profound effects on the participants' lives. Extending life expectancy 7 years, reducing depression incidence by maybe 30%, suicide by 5-fold. I mean, these are big effects on important outcomes. So I do think it would be important to incorporate, say, in courses on the sociology of religion, some of the positive effects of participation in religious communities. Likewise, in courses on the psychology of religion. In my own discipline in epidemiology, I think any course on social epidemiology should include at least just one lecture on religious communities and health. So what's taught is largely a function of the faculty member teaching it and the choices they make. And so I think what we need is faculty members deciding, no, it's important to present a balanced perspective and not to overemphasize or exclusively emphasize those harms that have come out of religious communities. I think it's really important to address both from the perspective of academic work, but also from the perspective of the life and practice of religious communities themselves. I think both sides are quite critical. So that's what I would like to see happen, both in my own discipline of public health, but sort of more broadly in academic settings on this topic of religious community.
Well, wow, thank you for an excellent presentation and great answers to all the questions. And as you see, there's a lot of interest in your work. There are people, the questions just keep coming in. So we really appreciate you being part of this. And please, everybody, give a round of applause to Tyler VanderWeele. We won't be able to hear it. I don't think we will, but again, excellent job. You can hear me clapping. So great job. It was outstanding. And please, everybody, come back in February, the 23rd of February. We'll have Jason Riley, columnist for the Wall Street Journal, as our next speaker. So thanks again, Tyler. We appreciate it.
Thank you all. It was a pleasure being with you today.
Thank you.